It was a bright morning at Andrews Air Force Base, and Flight 421 was ready for a routine transcontinental journey. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware that this flight would soon become the most unforgettable experience of their lives. Among them was a man named Daniel Hayes, a software engineer with a love for aviation but no formal pilot training. He had always dreamed of flying, but today fate had far grander plans for him. As the plane ascended, all seemed normal. Flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisles, offering beverages and snacks. Children laughed in the seats behind, and business people tapped away on laptops. Suddenly, without warning, the captain's voice came over the intercom, tense and shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical malfunction with the cockpit systems. Please remain calm." Panic rippled through the cabin like electricity. Daniel, sensing the gravity of the situation, peered toward the cockpit. He could see the first officer trying frantically to stabilize the controls. The plane shuddered violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Oxygen masks dropped as the aircraft dipped sharply. It was then that Daniel heard a voice, barely audible over the alarms. "I was a pilot once." The words came from an elderly man seated in 28A. Daniel looked at him, initially confused. The man's eyes were sharp, filled with a lifetime of experience. "I trained decades ago in fighter jets," he continued, "but age has taken my wings. You can help now." Before Daniel could ask how, a series of warning lights flashed across the cockpit. The plane was losing altitude rapidly, and the autopilot was unresponsive. Every second mattered. Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline, his heart pounding like a war drum. The elderly man guided him calmly, explaining the essential controls in a voice steady as a river. "Listen closely," he said, pointing to the throttle and joystick. "You need to keep the nose level. Stabilize the wings. Trust the instruments, they won't lie." Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the controls. He had only flown small flight simulators, yet now his fingers danced across real buttons and switches, feeling their weight, the resistance of levers, the feedback of real flight. Around him, passengers screamed and prayed, the cabin shaking with turbulence and fear. Then, over the radio, a new sound cut through the chaos. The roar of fighter jets. F-22 Raptors, elite Air Force interceptors, were streaking across the sky, their pilots tracking the distressed Flight 421. They were not there to shoot, but to escort. To assist in the most modern rescue operation imaginable, the elderly man instructed Daniel to keep steady. "They're here to guide you. Follow their signals. They'll show you the safest path." Daniel glanced out the window. Sleek jets sliced through clouds at supersonic speed, flying in precise formations. It was a scene straight out of an action movie, but the stakes were terrifyingly real. In that moment, Daniel realized that he was no longer just a passenger. He had become the pilot of a nearly incapacitated plane, responsible for over 100 lives. Panic wrestled with determination inside him. He remembered every simulator lesson, every YouTube tutorial he had ever watched. It was time to put theory into practice. With the guidance of the elderly former pilot and the signals from the F-22s. Daniel began to regain control. Slowly, carefully, he leveled the wings, eased the nose up, and stabilized the descent. The passengers felt it, too, a slight easing of tension. A glimmer of hope amid the terror. The scene outside the windows was breathtaking. Fighter jets darted around like guardian angels, their afterburners glowing like molten fire. The sky seemed alive with urgency. Each second, a battle between gravity and survival. And in the midst of it, Daniel felt a strange connection between man, machine, and the skilled guidance of those who had flown before him. As Flight 421 continued its precarious journey, Daniel realized that this was more than just a struggle to land safely. It was a test of courage, trust, and human resilience. The next steps would determine whether this morning would end in disaster or an extraordinary tale of survival. The roar of the F-22 Raptors filled the sky as they circled Flight 421, sleek bodies cutting through the clouds with precision. Daniel's hands gripped the controls tightly, sweat streaming down his forehead. Every warning light in the cockpit screamed danger, and yet, amid the chaos, a strange sense of determination settled over him. He had survived the first moments of panic, but the real challenge had only just begun. Asterisk, the elderly man in 28A leaned closer, his voice calm but firm. Daniel, follow their lead. These pilots are the best in the world. Trust them. Daniel nodded, his fingers tightening around the yoke. The F-22s began performing coordinated maneuvers. Signaling the safest flight path down toward Andrews Air Force Base, each jet moved with calculated grace. Cutting the wind with a precision that made Daniel's stomach churn. Asterisk, suddenly, Flight 421 shuddered violently again. The autopilot had completely failed, leaving Daniel to manage both the throttle and the complex flaps system manually. The plane tilted dangerously to one side, and a collective gasp rose from the passengers. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He focused on the instruments, carefully adjusting the controls. Listening to the elderly man's instructions, counter the roll. Don't fight the plane, work with it. Asterisk, outside the windows, the F-22s created a visual corridor. Pilots used light signals and wing gestures, guiding Daniel through turbulent air currents and around unstable weather pockets. Lightning streaked across the horizon, adding to the drama. Thunder shook the cabin, rattling luggage in the overhead compartments. Daniel's nerves screamed at him to panic, but he forced himself to breathe deeply, to follow the guidance meticulously. Asterisk, steady. Steady, the elderly man murmured. You've got this. Asterisk, as the plane descended further, Daniel had to make split-second decisions. A sudden gust of wind threatened to tilt the plane into a dangerous dive. He adjusted the ailerons and applied gradual throttle. The F-22s reacted instantly, moving into positions to block turbulence and act as a buffer. Daniel could feel the difference. The air suddenly felt more controlled, more manageable. Asterisk, meanwhile, cabin attendants were doing their best to calm terrified passengers. Mothers hugged children, elderly passengers clutched seat handles, and everyone stared in awe as the fighter jets flanked the plane like protective wolves. Daniel caught glimpses of people whispering prayers, some recording the unbelievable scene with their phones. The world outside seemed like a war zone movie set, yet the reality was far more terrifying. Asterisk, minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Daniel's muscles ached from the tension, his mind racing with calculations he had never imagined he would make in real life. Yet with each adjustment, the plane responded better. He began to anticipate its reactions, feeling a connection with the massive aircraft, almost like an extension of his own body. The guidance from the elderly pilot was a lifeline. The F-22s were guardians in the sky, and Daniel was the unlikely hero holding it all together. Asterisk, suddenly a warning blared louder than before. The engines were overheating, and there was risk of a complete mechanical failure. Panic rippled through the cabin again, but Daniel blocked it out, focusing entirely on the instruments. We need to slow down, the elderly man shouted, pointing at the throttle. Daniel pulled back, carefully reducing speed without losing lift. The plane shuddered, but remained stable. Asterisk, outside, the lead F-22 signaled to turn. Daniel followed, banking the plane carefully, trusting the pilots to lead the way. The maneuver required precision, balancing altitude and speed while keeping passengers safe. Sweat ran down his face as he executed the turn flawlessly. A collective sigh of relief passed through the cabin as the turbulence lessened, and passengers began to hope. Asterisk, the elderly man leaned back, exhaustion etched on his face, but pride shining in his eyes. Daniel, you're doing something no one thought possible. Keep going. Daniel nodded, his adrenaline fueling his determination. The landing approach was still miles away, and the most critical phase, touchdown, loomed ahead. The F-22s adjusted formation, preparing to guide Flight 421 to the runway. Their expert maneuvers provided a visual guide for Daniel, allowing him to line up the plane perfectly. Asterisk, as they approached Andrews Air Force Base. Daniel had to manage descent, wind shear, and the remaining mechanical uncertainties. The fighter jets flashed lights signaling corrections. Daniel adjusted pitch, roll, and throttle with painstaking precision. The plane dipped lower and lower, and passengers gripped their armrests, whispering prayers and gasping at every movement. Asterisk. The roar of jet engines and the echo of turbulence filled the air as Flight 421 finally aligned with the runway. Daniel's mind raced, calculating the final descent. The elderly man's voice cut through the noise. "You've got this, Daniel. Trust yourself." With a deep breath, Daniel guided the plane down, the wheels brushing against the tarmac in a tense, screeching landing. Asterisk. The cabin erupted in relief and applause as the plane taxied to a stop. Daniel leaned back, exhausted but exhilarated, as the elderly man patted his shoulder. "You did it, son. You really did it." Asterisk. Outside, the F-22S circled triumphantly, their afterburners lighting up the sky like a victory salute. Daniel looked out at the jets, a mixture of awe and disbelief washing over him. He had gone from an ordinary passenger to a pilot in the most extraordinary rescue operation imaginable. Asterisk for the passengers. The experience was surreal fear, turned into gratitude, chaos into admiration, and for Daniel, the morning had changed everything. He had faced the impossible, survived the terror, and emerged as the hero no one expected. By the wisdom of a veteran and the unmatched skill of elite fighter pilots. Asterisk. The roar of the F-22 Raptors faded into the distance as Flight 421 taxied safely to the gate. Emergency crews swarmed the tarmac. Though their presence was more precautionary than necessary, the landing had been flawless. Passengers slowly unbuckled, their legs trembling from the tension that had held them captive for the past hour. Daniel Hayes sat in his seat for a moment longer, hands still gripping the yoke, heart still pounding. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Asterisk. The elderly man in 28A finally stood, leaning heavily on his cane but smiling warmly. "Daniel, you've done more than survive. You've inspired every person on this plane. You didn't just fly the aircraft, you carried hope." Daniel gave a weak smile. Still trying to process the enormity of the situation, Asterisk news crews had already arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. Alerted by military radar and air traffic control, within minutes reporters swarmed the area, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward the plane. Daniel could hear snippets of questions from the cockpit. "Sir, how did you manage to land this plane? Were you trained?" Asterisk. The thought of explaining what had happened seemed impossible. He wasn't a professional pilot. He was just a software engineer who had followed the guidance of a retired aviator and the expert maneuvers of elite fighter pilots. Yet every camera and recorder demanded a story, a hero, a face to put to the miraculous rescue. Asterisk. As the passengers disembarked, many approached Daniel with tears in their eyes, gratitude pouring out in shaky voices. "You saved our lives," a mother whispered, holding her child tightly. "I can't believe what just happened." "Thank you." Businessman clasped Daniel's hand firmly. "You were incredible. Truly incredible." Each word struck him with the reality that he had done something extraordinary, something that would be remembered for years. Asterisk. Military officials approached, their expressions a mix of respect and disbelief. "Mr. Hayes, your actions today were extraordinary. You followed our intercept pilot's instructions perfectly and landed a compromised aircraft without incident. You're lucky to be alive." Daniel nodded, humbled. He had faced death moments earlier and survived through focus, courage, and the guidance of those more experienced. Asterisk. Inside the terminal, phones buzzed and notifications flooded social media. Videos from passengers' phones captured the dramatic approach, the guiding jets, and Daniel's hands trembling over the controls. The story went viral within minutes. Hashtags trending worldwide. Hashtag passenger pilot. Hashtag Flight 421 hero. Hashtag F2 to rescue. News outlets aired footage of the fighter jets escorting the plane, commentators describing the scene as something out of a Hollywood blockbuster. Asterisk. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself in a whirlwind of interviews. Each reporter asked the same questions. He could only recount fragments the elderly pilot's guidance. The signals from the F-22s and the collective fear and courage in the cabin. He emphasized the teamwork, the precision of the Air Force pilots, and the calm instructions of the man who had once flown fighter jets decades ago. Despite the media frenzy. The real impact was on the passengers. Airlines offered counseling and support, but most seemed more interested in sharing their incredible experience. Photos circulated of Daniel shaking hands with the elderly man, the two of them framed by the sleek lines of an F-22 in the background. To many, it was a visual symbol of courage and mentorship. The passing of experience from one generation to another, Daniel's own internal journey, however, was far from over. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him exhausted and contemplative. He replayed every moment, analyzing decisions and maneuvers. What if he had panicked? What if a minor error had caused disaster? He realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to act in spite of it. He had faced the unimaginable and survived because he trusted others, trusted the process, and trusted himself. Back at his home, Daniel's story continued to spread. Schools invited him to speak about bravery and decision-making under pressure. Aviation organizations reached out, offering opportunities to train formally. Recognizing the raw skill and composure he had demonstrated, yet Daniel remained humble, insisting that the success of Flight 421 had been a collaborative effort. The retired pilot, the Air Force interceptors, and even the passengers themselves had played roles in the miracle. As he lay in bed that night, Daniel thought about the elderly man who had whispered the words that changed everything. "I was a pilot once." Those words had sparked a chain reaction, turning an ordinary passenger into an extraordinary pilot and a routine flight into a story that would inspire millions. Daniel knew he had crossed a threshold. He had glimpsed human potential in its most extreme form and had survived to tell the tale. While the world celebrated him as a hero, Daniel felt something deeper, quiet understanding of responsibility, courage, and the fragility of life. Flight 421 had taught him that ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts when circumstances demanded. And though he had become a public figure overnight, he knew that the real heroism had been in the calm, steady guidance and unyielding teamwork that had made the impossible possible. Outside, the sky remained vast and indifferent, yet to Daniel it seemed different now, full of possibility, danger, and the silent promise of new challenges. He had touched the edge of fear and emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware than ever before. The story of Flight 421 was far from over, and the lessons it carried would echo through his life and the lives of all who witnessed the miracle that day. The days following Flight 421 were surreal for Daniel Hayes. Headlines screamed his name, across newspapers and websites. Ordinary passenger. Extraordinary pilot, software engineer, saves flight with F-22 guidance. In miracle at 30,000 feet. Television crews lined the streets outside his apartment, cameras flashing as reporters sought interviews. Yet amidst the frenzy, Daniel felt neither pride nor ego. What mattered to him most was understanding the magnitude of what had happened and the lessons it carried. Government officials and military personnel personally visited him to debrief and commend his actions. A senior Air Force general shook Daniel's hand firmly. "Mr. Hayes, what you did today is unprecedented. Not only did you save over 100 lives, but you did so under extreme pressure with no formal pilot training. You are a hero in every sense of the word." Daniel felt a mixture of humility and disbelief. He had always admired pilots, but never imagined stepping into that role himself. The elderly man from C-28A, who had quietly guided him through the chaos, was hailed alongside Daniel as the unseen mentor. They had forged a bond unlike any other one, born of fear, trust, and a shared understanding of what it meant to face life-or-death moments together. Daniel often reflected on his mentor's words. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action despite fear." That phrase became a personal mantra, shaping not only his understanding of bravery, but his approach to life itself. Schools invited him to speak. Sharing the story of Flight 421 with students across the nation, Daniel emphasized teamwork, preparation, and trust. He explained how he had relied not on instinct alone, but on guidance from experts and careful observation of instruments. Anyone can rise to the occasion if they stay calm. Listen and act decisively, he told audiences, watching the faces of young students light up with inspiration. Meanwhile, the aviation community extended numerous opportunities. Flight schools offered scholarships, and airlines sought him as a guest lecturer. Daniel, who had once only dreamed of flying simulators, now found himself training with real aircraft instructors. Learning to translate his experience into formal piloting skills, each lesson reminded him of that fateful day, the fear, the adrenaline, and the realization that ordinary people could perform extraordinary feats under the right circumstances. Yet it wasn't just public recognition that shaped him. On a personal level, Daniel experienced a transformation. He became more confident, more decisive, and more attuned to both danger and opportunity. The terror of Flight 421 had given way to resilience, and the lessons learned at 30,000 feet now influenced every decision he made. Small problems at work seemed trivial. Challenges in daily life were approached with the calm precision of someone who had faced literal chaos. As months passed, Daniel's story continued to captivate the world. Social media posts chronicling his heroics reached millions. Documentary teams sought interviews, and he participated in a televised panel with the F-22 pilots who had guided him. Together, they recounted the sequence of events, the meticulous coordination, the split-second decisions, and the trust that had made the miracle possible. Daniel was careful to emphasize the teamwork over individual glory. "The pilots were my wings," he often said. "Without them, none of this would have been possible." 1 year later, Daniel returned to Andrews Air Force Base, not as a frightened passenger, but as a recognized figure in aviation circles. He walked onto the tarmac, gazing at the runway where he had landed Flight 421. The F-22 soared overhead in a ceremonial formation, paying homage to a man who had, for a brief moment, become one of them. Officials and fellow pilots applauded, and Daniel's mentor stood beside him, eyes glistening with pride. Daniel's personal growth extended beyond aviation. He became a motivational speaker, traveling to corporate events and educational seminars, sharing his story as a testament to human resilience. He emphasized that heroism is not the exclusive domain of the trained or elite. Ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could achieve the impossible with courage, focus, and the support of others. And yet, Daniel never sought fame or wealth from his experience. The true reward, he often said, was knowing that he had helped save lives, and that the trust placed in him had not been misplaced. He remained humble, constantly reminding himself of the fragility of life and the importance of preparation, mentorship, and teamwork. Years later, Flight 421 became a case study in aviation schools worldwide. Pilots and students analyzed every maneuver, every decision, and every moment of coordination between Daniel and the escorting F-22s. His story became a symbol of hope, resilience, and human potential, a reminder that in the face of chaos, calm minds guided by experience could achieve the extraordinary. In quiet moments, Daniel still thought of that morning. The adrenaline, the fear, the roar of the jets, and the guidance of his mentor. That day had changed him forever, instilling a deep respect for life, courage, and the power of trust. Flight 421 was more than a story of survival. It was a legacy, a testament to what humanity could achieve when ordinary individuals rose to meet extraordinary challenges. As he looked up at the sky, watching the clouds drift by, Daniel smiled. He had been a passenger who became a pilot, a man thrust into a storm of chaos and emerged transformed. And though the world would remember him as a hero, he knew the truth. The heroism belonged not to one, but to the collective courage, trust, and guidance that had made the impossible possible. Flight 421 had ended safely, but its legacy would soar forever.